end of the meeting, the last 20 minutes or so, I need some time for committee business, go over budgets and some other issues that I need to update the committee on. We have some officials from PSPC back with us today. Ms. Reza, welcome back. I understand you'll have an opening statement for us. Please go ahead for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. Joining me today are Dominique Laporte, Assistant Deputy Minister for Procurement, Molly Royce, the Associate Assistant Deputy Minister for Procurement, and Catherine Poulin, Assistant Deputy Minister for Departmental Oversight. Je tiens tout d'abord à remercier le comité.
I want to start by thanking the committee for this opportunity to appear to discuss the procurement ombudsman report on contracts awarded to McKinsey. It's important to me as the Deputy Minister with a key responsibility for procurement to be given this opportunity to comment. I would also like to sincerely...
This device is not working for me, so I need someone on the technical side to bring me one. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll just pause for a moment. Ms. Reza, if you can continue, and then we'll interrupt you if it's not working, but please go ahead.
En tant que sous-ministre dont l'une des...
As Deputy Minister with a key responsibility for procurement, it's important for me to be given the opportunity to comment. I would also like to sincerely thank the procurement ombudsman and his team for their review of the contracts awarded to McKinsey. We have carefully considered the entire report, not only the recommendations where PSPC is implicated directly, but all recommendations to consider how we can take a leadership role to further strengthen procurement practices.
In the midst of increasing public scrutiny and discourse related to procurement practices, the Prime Minister tasked the President of the Treasury Board and the Minister of Public Services and Procurement to undertake a review of contracts awarded to McKinsey and examine if contracting processes complied with Treasury Board policy and departmental internal control frameworks. Then, shortly thereafter, in February 2023, the Minister of Public Services and Procurement made a further request that the Procurement Ombudsman conduct a review of federal contracts awarded to McKinsey. Consistent with the result of the first review, the Procurement Ombudsman found no instances of political interference, no wrongdoing, and no fraud. I believe this is important to the committee and to the procurement workforce who take their stewardship and integrity responsibilities seriously. The Ombudsman's report looked at 32 contracts with McKinsey. PSPC was the contracting authority responsible for 23. As a result of his review, the Ombudsman made 3 recommendations directed to PSPC. The department accepts and welcomes the recommendations and is implementing an action plan to further strengthen procurement processes, specifically as it relates to better documentation, among others. For example, one area of this review relates to the verification of security clearances for resources. I would like to reassure this committee that all the McKinsey resources had the required security level to perform work and to access sensitive information and assets. That being said, the OPPO report identifies documentation shortcomings, for example, noting that the security clearance records should also be consistently included in procurement files. As a result of the report, I've asked security and procurement officials to take a step back to reconsider the existing rationale as to why the security clearance and contract records need to be kept in 2 physical places, and if this is still relevant as we move to e-procurement. Turning to examine the procurement instruments that were used for contract award, PSPC took steps in 2021 to establish a national master standing offer as an efficient approach to procure proprietary McKinsey benchmarking services that were in demand from client departments. In total, PSPC issued 19 contracts under the standing offer, which is now expired. The Ombudsman's observations on the standing offer are actively informing the next iteration of instruments related to procuring benchmarking services. Indépendamment des constatations relatives à l'offre à commande,
Separate from the findings related to the standing offer, the Ombudsman concluded that, taken collectively, his observations led him to believe there were instances that the procurement processes created a strong perception of favoritism towards McKinsey. PSPC has no direct evidence of this. We have responded to the procurement ombudsman, noting some of the assumptions and interpretations differ from those made by PSPC. The ombudsman acknowledged this by including references to our views in his report, which he referenced in his testimony to this committee earlier this week. In conclusion, I would like to specify with the committee that as the Deputy Minister and as senior officials responsible for the procurement function in PSPC, we take to heart the observations and recommendations made by the Ombudsman. We have a responsibility to better understand and address his findings, especially as they relate to ensuring better record keeping and transparency to advance both the process and controls related to procurement. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll start with Mrs. Block for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And through you to our witnesses, I will be, I believe, asking questions of Ms. Reza, but if others have the answers, certainly feel free to pass those on. Earlier this year, reports from the Auditor General and the Procurement Ombudsman on the Arrive scam debacle raised serious concerns about contracting, particularly in the sole sourcing of several contracts. Today, you're here, appearing on the heels of yet another report from the Procurement Ombuds, which raises serious concerns in regard to contracting in relation to McKinsey. Of deep concern is the OPO's comments regarding the National Master Standing Offer, or NMSO, and that none of the call-ups had any justification for sole sourcing. Yet your department approved them all, shoveling out tens of millions of dollars to this company. Who signed off on these call-ups?
Thank you very much for the question, and I'll give some context around the call-ups. NMSO.
Mr. Chair, I did not ask for context. I asked who signed off on these call-ups. Who was responsible for signing off?
The call-ups were mostly signed off at the procurement officer level, some at the manager level. We can provide the breakdown of the individual.
Yeah, I would like the names. If you could provide that to the committee, I would appreciate that. When the NMSO for McKinsey's benchmarking services was established, who at PSPC signed off on that?
I believed it was signed off at the ADM level of procurement. So we'll confirm again the names as people move between jobs. It was in 2021, unless you know.
Question. The National Master Standing Offer was actually established as per our normal protocol for all National Master Standing Offers. A commodity lead is responsible for the approval. In the case of professional services, it was at the Executive 2 level. And that was the level that approved this National Master Standing Offer. And just to go back to the earlier question, there was a sole source justification in place for the National Master Standing Offer at the time, an integrity check, as well as price support to ensure that the price was fair and reasonable.
Right. I'm looking for names.
We're happy to provide the name, but I can tell you the level. It was an executive, a senior director in our procurement office, and it was in 2021, which was before I was there, and I believe the individual is no longer employed in the department, but happy to provide the name.
Thank you very much. The Procurement Ombudsman also found in his review of the McKinsey contracts that PSPC failed to provide a statement of work on the vast majority of call-ups against the standing offer. The Ombudsman said in his report that he could not determine to what extent McKinsey was allowed to define the contract requirements for these departments. This is exactly the type of thing that happened with GC Strategies in the Arrive scam contracts. Your department allowing a private contractor to determine their own scope of work. Why is your department making it a regular practice to allow companies to determine the terms of government contracts that they will be awarded?
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Chair. Just to confirm, when a national master standing offer is established for a unique product, such as the benchmarking that McKinsey provided, the statement of work that was associated with the establishment of that tool has been traditionally the master statement of work that's been used to pull call-ups from underneath that. That was from 1995 to about 2021 for all national standing offers of this nature. In 2021, we took a step back and we decided to add increasing scrutiny and documentation around support. And by 2022, 2023, we had added further requirements around the statements of work. But the traditional historical piece was to use the statement of work associated with the establishment of the procurement tool, given that it was an individual, unique, proprietary service provided to Canada.
So I am simply going by what the procurement ombudsman reported on, and he questioned the fairness and the transparency of the lack of documentation that was available to determine whether or not McKinsey defined its own scope of work. So we'll leave that there. I believe that there are questions around that, around fairness and transparency. Those are the procurement ombudsman's words, not mine. He also found multiple cases of departments changing procurement strategies to allow for McKinsey's participation. He also found that departments avoided mandatory methods of supply to direct contracts to McKinsey. And then he found that departments failed to establish cost estimates before discussions with McKinsey. And he found that bids were inappropriately reevaluated, resulting in McKinsey being the only compliant bidder and being awarded the contract. All of this under the watchful eye of PSPC. I believe this is a colossal failure of your department's core purpose. What value does your department offer aside from the rubber stamping of corrupt procurement practices?
I'm afraid I have to interrupt because that is past our time. Perhaps get to it in the next round or provide in writing. I will remind everyone, I know you've been with us before, but our committee as well has passed a motion that all requests for information are to be returned to us within 3 weeks. Mr. Kuzmierczak, I believe you're up.
Yes, Chair. Mr. Reza, you had, in your response, you referred to the National Master Standing Offer. You talked about, referenced 1995 to 2021. I didn't quite understand sort of the point that you were making there. Can you just repeat that a little bit and take your time to clarify that?
Thank you very much. I was trying to build the context that within procurement, we use different methods of supply. And there's many of them, and they're competing, and some of them have been long-standing. Some started in 1995. A lot were established in 2005, the ones that we hear frequently around the information services, TBIPs and SBIPs, which look at solutions, came on longer. So what I was trying to make clear is that these have been, for the last 20 years, methods of supply that we look to modernize and build on and have existed in for the last 20 years in terms of how we deliver procurement. We're constantly looking at how to improve them, but these are not one-offs, or they were not created for any specific supplier. In the case of benchmarking, which is an area the government needs as part of their independent review and their quality assurance, we have 4 or 5 vendors that have had similar arrangements, and this has all been publicly and transparently posted on government websites for many years, so it's not something done that's unique and not well understood. But if you permit, I'm going to turn... Dominique, est-ce que tu as quelque chose à rajouter? We're good.
Can you explain to Canadians the value that benchmarking brings to the work of government? Because I want to start from first principles here. What's the value of benchmarking that companies like McKinsey and others provide?
Thank you very much for your question. And really, the client departments will be best placed to talk about the value that they bring. But at a high level, benchmarking is against global standards practices using proprietary data sets, gives the government a sense of where they are on their transformation projects, on citizen delivery. It looks at a global overview, and it's actually a requirement of Treasury Board policies to have that independent kind of review function, which can be achieved through benchmarking contracts, as we described, or through independent audit.
What does benchmarking, what value does it provide to the government? Is it a matter of efficiency to be able to more efficiently deliver government programs? Is it about effectiveness? Is it all of the above?
I would add that it is all of the above in the sense that benchmarking gives you kind of a gold standard to aim for, understands whether or not Gates can proceed in big IT transformation projects. I know that PSPC as a client department actually competed some McKinsey tools, and they came and looked at our pay processing and were able to benchmark with their training and introduce certain efficiencies that were pretty significant for the pay function of the government.
When I had a chance to question the procurement ombudsman here this week, I asked him flat out, did he find any instances of fraud? And he answered unequivocally, no. I asked the procurement ombudsman, is there any evidence in your review of corruption? And his answer was unequivocal, no. And I asked him, did he find in his analysis and investigation any examples of political interference? And his response, unequivocal, was no. What he did find is, as you had mentioned, a strong perception of favoritism. And he was referring to the practice of changing procurement strategies midstream. And so the ombudsman criticized departments for changing requirements between whether they required a task-based contract or solution-based.
Sir, let me interrupt. Pull your mic down a tiny bit, please.
Contract, pull it down. Oh, does that work? Is this better? Is this okay? Is this better? Okay. So I wanted to ask, to start, if you can explain the differences between these two types of contracts, but then also just speak to that criticism of the perception of favoritism that the ombudsman had found. If you can help us understand both of those things.
Let me start, and then I'll turn to my colleague to add some remarks. I read that with grave concern, and it's in the report, and certainly we wanted to work with the ombudsman to unpack it. When you think of procurement strategies that change, sometimes a client comes and they don't know the procurement world. They don't know what is the actual right method of supply, what is the best. And at the same time, we're trying to change how we do procurement. We want to move away from task-based procurement, where you're asking someone to produce 1, 2, 3, versus to a solution-based procurement, where they're providing the government with a turnkey solution. This is our opportunity, this is our problem. So there's always lots of different moving pieces, and each individual procurement has a procurement plan. And that procurement plan gets locked in when they go into the solicitation. Until then, things are moving back and forth and are fluid. It's being shaped to provide the best output for Canadians. I'm going to stop here and see Dominique.
And I'm sorry, I'm glad you're stopping there, because that is right at our 6 minutes. But we'll get a chance to come back. Mrs. Vignola, please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll allow my colleagues to put on their earpieces. Thank you, Madam Reza, Madam Roy, Mr. Laporte, and Madam Poulin. Thank you for being here with us. In response to the report, PSPC declared in paragraph 118 that it had legitimate reasons to adopt the approach it adopted when it awarded the non-competitive NMSO, and used the same approach for the other call-ups, non-competitive orders as well. In your introduction, you said you have received well the recommendations made by the Ombudsman. You have taken note of them, but they are not really appropriate. That's what I understand. What are those reasons? Why was McKinsey able to have a non-competitive NMSO? Well, we have data, we've heard all of that, but from what we've heard, it would appear that we have people here in Canada who can collect data already paid for by taxpayers and a pan-Canadian institution. Why McKinsey in particular?
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. I'll try to answer. After that, I'll give my colleagues the opportunity to answer. The first part is it's important to note that McKinsey was one of the 5 suppliers, so there was transparency at our end. This was not something that was done only for McKinsey. It was a decision that was made that had to do with the that for benchmarking we needed access. There were rules that allowed that if there was sole sourcing, we could come up with a procurement method
To the suppliers and to the clients to move expeditiously. If you know that there's only one that can compete, we go there. Mais au deuxième volet, Denis?
Merci. Souvent, quand on regarde quelque chose,
Thank you. Sometimes, in hindsight, it's easy to see whether things were white or black. But sometimes it's not obvious because this was data that was only available to McKinsey. As Ms. Reza has said, we established agreements with 4 other suppliers. So this was transparent, known to everyone. I don't think that our procurement officers got up one morning with the intention to favor one company above others. So there was transparency. Thank you. Now, the justifications that were missing in the file, where are they? Answer. The justifications were established and were always in the procurement tool. It's because the procurement ombudsman asked for a single justification whenever clients wanted to use that. So that's why we started thinking of coming up with that method. But before that, it was the standard to use the justification that had been prepared when the tool was created.
Of individual justification.
Pourquoi?
Why don't we justify each of these steps in a contract out of transparency to make sure that there's no appearance of collusion or favoritism? Why, from the onset, don't we include those justifications? Why don't we do that?
je dirais que c'est un point qui...
Answer. That was noted by the ombudsperson, and we can do better. We can improve best practices when it comes to documents. So in my capacity as Assistant Deputy Minister, I take this seriously. There's a new position for quality assurance, and that person will make sure that those stages are respected. Each critical stage for procurement is documented. We are creating tools and procedures that will help us respond to that concern. If I may add, we will decide on the key data and the key steps. We award 400,000 contracts every year in the government of Canada, the value of $38 million. So it will be nice to have everything in the system for transparency reasons, but we need to work together with OGGO and the Auditor General to find out what are the key documents. Thank you. During your remarks, you talked about an action plan. is it possible to submit that action plan to this committee very quickly? With pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Vignola. Mr. Bachrach, please go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. This is obviously a complex matter. At the same time, when you read through the Ombudsman's report, it's pretty scathing about the procurement process. And you've accepted the findings of the Ombudsman. What I'd like to get at is why those shortcomings exist. So the lack of documentation, for instance, why is that occurring? Is it sloppiness? Is it because there's a lack of respect for the stated requirements that are laid out in the procurement process? Is there something more nefarious going on? What's the reason for the shortcoming?
I think we're all going to be fighting for response time, but I'll tell you that there is no one single reason, and we'll unpack it in many ways. One of the things that we saw in the report was there are no CIO conflict of interest declarations on some of the reports. And I said, why not? And we went back to the supply manual, which provides a direction to procurement officers and to clients. It doesn't have to be on file if you're a public servant, because your code of conduct manages it. So what is defined as a lack of documentation in the report, that's accurate, but we haven't established a baseline of requiring it in the first place. Same with the security requirements. You know, I saw that the security requirements weren't there. Well, they were there, but they weren't in the 2 or 3 places they were supposed to be in. So we need to rationalize the lack of documentation. We need to be clear on what's causing it. We need to capture.
I'm not quite sure I understand the nuance behind that point. They were there, but they weren't where they were supposed to be. Doesn't that mean they weren't there?
If I may add to that, over time, there was a different way to store information on the record. It could have been by email. It could have been stored on some local drive. So I have to say that it's not because something was not there, and I do appreciate that we don't have the evidence to show that it was there, but this is where we need to leverage electronic procurement solution that will make sure that we document every step and that we maintain a central repository of all information, because going back in time, Madame Reza was mentioning the numbers of procurement that we handle on a yearly basis. So we need to improve on the tool, and this is exactly what we've been doing over the last 5 years.
And just to add that point, if I could, in terms of the use of these methods of supply, and the reason that we do use them is due to the flexibility that they provide to the system and for us to be able to leverage them. And I would just wanted to add that as of 2023, we did require sole source justifications, statements of work that were clearly defined requirements for all of the benchmarking national master standing offers until they expired. And going forward in the future, we'll be procuring this type of capacity through a competitive process.
So the national master standing offer that we're talking about for McKinsey pre-existed that commitment in 2023 to start documenting everything more thoroughly?
That's correct.
Okay.
So it was consistent with the approach that we were taking in the business line at the time, but we have adjusted that in light of the observations that have been made, and we noted the requirement to have additional documentation.
So in your response to the Ombudsman's report, you pushed back on some of the assumptions and characterizations of the lack of rationale for the National Master Standing Offer decision. You say that, quote, rationale for making the decision cannot be assumed in the report without evidence. My read is that the Ombudsman didn't take issue with the rationale. He was taking issue with the lack of evidence. So the question is, where's the evidence? And why did you push back on that finding, which is that the evidence wasn't provided? It seems like you're making an argument that you're pushing back on something the Ombudsman didn't actually say, which is that the rationale were incorrect. What the Ombudsman was saying was there was no rationale, and so he doesn't understand, like, it's not transparent why that particular procurement process was chosen.
Thank you very much. Just quickly going back, lack of documentation haunts us, and we're fixing it. Like, I don't actually enjoy coming to committee to talk about lack of documentation, any inferences it puts, so that's got to be shut down. With respect to our response to the procurement ombudsman. We've accepted the findings, we've accepted the recommendation. On the issue of rationalization, it is because from our assessment, when we set up the National Master Standing Office, we did all the price verification, the rationale, the evidence. So adding on that each call-up had to have this individual justification was not in our kind of line of sight for the last 20 years. It is now.
In terms of getting back to my original question about the reason for the shortcomings, is it because it was not understood what the requirements were, or they weren't clearly enough laid out? Like, I'm a layperson when it comes to this stuff, but when I read the Ombudsman's report, he's like, there are clearly laid out requirements for documentation, and those requirements were not met. So either they were not met because they were missed, or because they weren't understood, or because they were, the people filling out the documentation didn't want to. Like, I'm just trying to understand why they weren't there.
Thank you very much. I don't think that there was an articulation or a requirement for the rationalization and justification for individual call-ups. That was required.
It wasn't articulated clearly enough to the people in charge of the procurement process.
It wasn't required as part of the procurement process. There's a distinction.
It wasn't required. Okay, interesting.
Thanks very much. Mrs. Kusi, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. A previous PSPC minister personally signed a $5.7 million contract, even though your department agreed that ESDC had not met the threshold for a sole source contract with McKinsey. Why did this minister personally sign this contract when your department had already challenged this contract?
Thank you very much for the question. By way of quick context setting, Treasury Board policy on management and procurement sets out the financial delegation of each of authority specifically related to each department, each minister. So for us, it's $5.7 million. Then each department actually sets up a delegation tool that's posted that tells you what level. You've often asked us from a authority to enter in a contract, what's your level, who signed it. So for the minister, anything over $4.5 million, this type of contract needed to go to the minister. To do that, we, Molly and I, have a role in this, took on additional requirements to ask the client to justify the contract. The initial set of justification was based on the 7 questions that are a Treasury Board template. The procurement officer went back, received additional information, was satisfied with the justification provided by ESDC, papered the file, provided a recommendation to Molly, and that turned into a recommendation for the minister to use her authority to enter into the contract. So there's pretty significant paper trail. I saw, as you did in the report, the commentary, but there was additional information provided as well as a robust rationale.
Could you please table this paperwork with the committee? Thank you. Have you received any direction from any procurement minister, before or after this contract on a procurement strategy with McKinsey?
No.
Has there been any indication of the minister of any other departments and agencies directing officials to specifically contract with McKinsey?
No.
I'm going to go back to the missing documents. So it seems to be a trend that documents will go missing in numerous procurement procedures that we review here at OGGO. And as I mentioned that in the previous meeting, this has been a trend in numerous reports of numerous parliamentary officers. The procurement ombudsman said on Monday that this is a long-standing issue that we've seen in many, many of our procurement practice reviews. The one distinction that I would note specific to McKinsey is the timing of these documentation lapses. Traditionally, we saw a lack of documentation across the board, but here we see it sometimes discrete times within a process where we would have documentation present for certain steps of the process, and then at seminal moments there would be a lack of documentation. That's the part that's concerning. So why do you think these departments are choosing not to document at times that seem inconvenient for them to document?
Thank you very much for the question. I would note that when you look at the universe of contracts that were reviewed in this review, there was 32. 19 of them are part of the National Master Standing Offer, so it's a very different set of documentation requirements that we've been discussing. The remaining ones were for the vast majority low contract value under, not all of them, but under 40,000. And I think that as the paperwork went back and forth, there was probably not enough hygiene and rigor around making sure it was well collated. Another issue when it comes to documentation and some of the frustration perhaps the committee notes, or I feel from the committee, is that when you do an evaluation of a bid, half of the bid documentation goes to the department that does the technical evaluation. And there's a whole bunch of bid methodology and material prepared there. And PSPC keeps the financial envelopes. They're kind of independent keys. And then we have to put the file back together and make sure documentation is well described. I don't know if you have any.
Thank you so much. I'll leave it there. If he's concerned, I'm concerned. In a $2.9 million competitive contract for ISCD, 2 bids were received, and McKinsey was not chosen because it did not have the best price and financial score in comparison to their technical capabilities. After this review, ISCD asked to reevaluate and choose McKinsey instead, despite the completion of this evaluation. In response, ISCD stated they would be happy to delete the financial evaluation email to hide the fact that they were requesting a change. McKinsey shockingly then received this contract. Do you condone the deletion of emails in order to favor certain companies in the procurement process?
Thank you very much for your question, Mr. Chair. Absolutely not, and PSPC was not involved in the procurement. Further, I picked up the phone and spoken to the ISED deputy, and he assures me that training is in place, and it was really inexperience and error, and it was noted.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Baines, before you start, bells are ringing. As everyone's aware, we have 27 minutes. We'll all vote electronically, so I'll cut off at, are you going to vote in person?
In the house.
Okay,
So Dwight Thompson.
so we'll suspend with 10 minutes to go. Is that fine for you? Wonderful. Mr. Baines, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our department officials for joining us again today. Elected officials come and go, so I think I've heard from you that this procurement process has gone back since 1995. Today, I heard, and we've heard from other witnesses in this committee about it going back to 2003, and the procurement process has not changed. My concern is that government officials have often been around for decades, and they've built relationships around with people, and there's subcontractors, contractors, and again, I know that the concern's been raised by some of our friends from across the way as well about the potential of collusion and getting favoritism. So what, and I think you mentioned training that's being done on the standards for procurement, some changes that are being made. What is PSPC doing to address the recurring issue of documentation missing from the files? Is there, I think we even heard from the minister that there's a new AI process that might be being implemented. Is that something that you can give us some knowledge around?
Thank you very much for the question. And it goes back a little bit to the earlier question. What is the implementation plan for this and other audits and what we heard in ArriveCan to avoid the documentation challenges we face? It goes back to training. It goes back, I know we've put a new quality assurance officer in place to be able to review the material. We have been talking about e-procurement. We have been identifying what actually is part of a procurement strategy in terms of documentation. And we've been looking at our own processes and looking to see how we can actually amp it up so that we have more clarity and transparency around, including using the Treasury Board open portal and the training associated with it. But if you permit, I'll pause here.
So thank you. DM Riza did touch on most of the elements, but also one of the things that we did this week is to send, first of all, we had town hall with all our staff. So we did make sure, because the last thing I want is for the procurement ombudsman to draw negative inference for the lack of information on record. I think this is very unfortunate, and it casts basically some doubt as to the motivation of our employees, and they don't want that. I think there's a clear desire to change. We've put something also as part of the PMAs, which are basically the management agreement of all the PG, including myself, the DGs, the director, to really make sure that this is a top priority and employees are going to be measured, including me, against that. So from now on, we're going to be insisting, we're going to be making sure that, we've learned also from ArriveCan with some checklists that are there that were not there before. And with that, we've got also the electronic procurement solution, which 98% of our procurement are now covered by that for PSPC. So a lot of action is being taken on that front, and I have to say that this is one of my key missions. And a year from now, the last thing we want is to be there and explain to this committee that there are some shortfall in the documentation.
On the electronic procurement process, it's an AI process. What measures are being taken so everybody understands the standards and procedures that are needed to train and on how that works?
In terms of the EPS, so basically it's a cloud-based solution. So the goal is to have all the key elements. So when the bid, for example, is published, so bidders are going to be able to bid on this platform. They are able to bid using that platform. So all the key documents, all the interaction with contracting authorities are no longer done by email. So in the past, for example, you used to send an email to the contracting authority. So this email maybe would get lost. So what's happening now is that we've got a central repository of all the key information, all the interaction. And what I'm very hopeful is that in future, we're going to be even to leverage that platform. So all the mandatory requirements are going to be there for bidders. The financial evaluation is going to be there. So there is still some investment, training that needs to be placed. But I have to say that in terms of keeping the information, we've got basically close to $9 billion of procurement that are now under the platform and 8,700 contracts.
Do you have data on how much of the human element is taken out of that and human error?
I don't have that information.
I think we should be clear, it's not AI, it's a cloud-based system. But I want to say we've been speaking a lot about documentation, record keeping, and the importance of it, but you used a word earlier that I recoiled at, and that is collusion. And here at PSPC and across the government of Canada, we look very carefully at our integrity and our stewardship, and we have a lot of things in place around collusion. And if you have a moment, Catherine...
I'm afraid we don't have a moment. We're running out of time. Thanks. We'll just finish up. I'm combining the next two rounds for the NDP and the block, so we'll do a 5-minute, and then you won't have anything next round. Go ahead, Mrs. Vignola.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Reza, when it comes to the recommendations made by the procurement ombudsman about security requirements, PSPC has indicated in the annex that they have come up with a new verification checklist for verifying professional services in February, and that a press release was sent to procurement staff in December 2023 to remind them of the requirements and the policy on security. First question, did those measures really help ensure respect for the security requirements? That was the first. Secondly, if the answer is yes or even no, it doesn't matter, how can we demonstrate its efficiency or inefficiency? How do we implement a plan of action with goals that we will make sure that those steps are well respected? Answer. I will start and then I'll give the floor to my colleagues. Now, what is interesting is that the issue is very complicated. We have 800,000 security codes for consultants that belong to us, and every year we have to review 100,000 security codes. And after that, we have to make sure that the procurement forms are well integrated. So there are lots of elements that need improvement. So now let me give the floor to Madam Poulin. Thank you very much for the question. We must distinguish documentation for staff security codes and that of the organization. So there are two issues that have been noted in the report. One, security codes for individuals was not documented. The contract security program has an entire system that can verify whether people do have the right security code. So it's possible to call, you can send an email. What is missing in the procurement file is evidence that those verifications were done. Second security issue has to do with contract security. It's important to review the contract. I'm sorry for interrupting. My question was not well understood, I believe. I don't believe my question was well understood. As PSPC in Annex 1 says, it came up with a new verification list. It sent a communique to members of staff, and it reminded them of the security requirements. That is what you did. This is my question. How are you making sure that the security policy is being properly implemented, looking at all aspects? I'm not talking about what the ombudsperson said. Now, what are you doing to make sure that staff are doing exactly what they are required to do? Answer. Thank you very much for the question. The issue doesn't have to do with security, but documentation. My colleague talked about it a while ago. We want to make sure that there's a checklist in the procurement files so that they should be traced to show that verification was done when it comes to the security of the contracts. He explained measures that will be implemented, the information given to staff, verifications that have to be done in the file to make sure that the checklists are present in the file and to ensure that there's evidence that the call, email, or confirmation was done for all of the security files. Question. And will a report follow those verifications, or ultimately, if it turns out that the committee would be the ones to look at the situation, is there a system in place to make sure that the staff who doesn't implement the procedure is informed or retrained? I'll allow my colleague to answer. My colleague from procurement. Thank you. We are introducing measures. I believe that staff do have a desire to show that they've done their work. We are working very well together. Our directors will be following up. We are going to be ensuring quality control. Directors will be explaining to their staff why we are doing what we're doing. And these are reminders. We also have, they will also be looking through their files to see what their shortcomings. Yes, these things will be brought to my attention and to Molly's attention. Reports will be presented every 2 months to make sure that we take the necessary measures, including training. Thank you.
Go to Mr. Backrack, and then since he's done, we will suspend. Mr. Backrack, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'd like to go back to this issue of changing the procurement strategy midstream, and this is under line of inquiry 1, competitive procurement practices leading to contracts awarded to McKinsey. And the Ombudsman lays out a storyline that I think for most people seems inappropriate, where, and this is with regard to a contract for $452,000 procured by ICID, and they had originally considered issuing a contract directly using a non-competitive process, and then a review board internally said, no, that's not appropriate, which that's good. So checks and balances worked. Then they reached out proactively to McKinsey and provided them with a link to the task-based supply arrangement. And in response, McKinsey said, no, we don't qualify for that. And so I came back to them again and said, hey, good news. We've changed it. Now it's a solution-based supply arrangement. So, you know, getting back to what we saw with ArriveCan, there's this situation where the vendors and the people in charge of procurement are in consultation, they're in communication about the shape of the actual procurement process. How is this, like, how is the public to understand this as anything other than completely inappropriate?
Thank you very much for the question. And from the outset, I'm going to say that PSPC was not involved in this procurement, so I'm just going to give some broad line observations. The methods of supply for the space of professional services are extremely complex. So on the face of it, the issue about which method of supply to use and pairing it or this view that there's favoritism, it may only be that the methods of supply themselves did not lend themselves to the right bidder. So it's not always an issue of trying to say, you need to go through this method of supply versus another. So I think that's a key piece of information that needs to be understood, because most of our clients don't understand which method of supply is actually the suitable method of supply. So that's the first thing I want to draw to your attention. The second thing I want to draw is that in this particular case, they competed. I believe they competed the solicitation. But again, we need ICE at the table. I don't know if you were.
Just going to add also to change from a task-based to a solution-based. This is something that is also encouraged under the directive on procurement. So we want to de-risk procurement. So I'm not sure, I cannot talk about the motivation in that case, but we want basically suppliers to take on more risk and less to client departments. So in itself, it's not necessarily a bad outcome. So not having been involved and not talking on behalf of ICE there, I have to say that this is now something that we're asking managers to do. Go to solution-based and stay away from task-based. So give that risk to the supplier instead of taking on. So the reason why it was done, I would say that the outcomes appears to me positive. So without.
I accept that. So solutions-based is better. But in this case, it's the chain of events. It's offering them this meal, and then they say, no, I can't do gluten. And then they say, oh, well, we've got this other meal for you. How about this? Like, it's that communication back and forth that makes it look to the public like things are getting cooked for a specific supplier. And if I go back to the Ombudsman's report, he says very clearly, collectively, these observations create a strong perception of favoritism towards McKinsey. One of the observations is that changing procurement strategies to allow for McKinsey's participation is one of the observations that led to that conclusion. Is that a conclusion that PSPC, I don't have your response in front of me right now, but is that one of the conclusions that you accepted in your response to the report?
That was one of the ones that we did not accept. So paragraph 110, where there's this collective overview, we have kind of views. First off, PSPC doesn't figure prominently in this area. We have one contract of under $25,000 where we have comments. Changing procurement strategies is okay. I go back to your initial question, Mr. Chair, about what would Canadians say. I think there's a balance as well as making sure we're optimizing the procurement system in a way that's efficient, fair, open, and transparent to make sure that we're putting the right tool in place to be able to execute and deliver on services. There's a balance. I'm not suggesting one way or the other, but it's okay to change procurement strategies. We often challenge when clients come to us and say, this is going to be sole source. We say no. And then we say, no, you have to compete it to say, are you sure you're not anybody else that can do it, that an A can? So it's okay to change.
But you must accept the perception. Like there's when there's communication back and forth with the vendor that seems to lead to a change in procurement practice, it creates a strong perception that things are being adjusted to meet the needs of a particular vendor. Like, this is the finding here. It's exactly what we saw with the ArriveCan, and it seems like, in talking to the procurement ombudsman, he says this is a systemic problem throughout government procurement.
So I'll quickly add,
I'm afraid that is our time, and we are going to suspend to allow members to vote, and we will be back probably about 15, 20 minutes.